Are Christians today required to keep the Old Testament law? What did Jesus really mean when he said he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it? And since we're saved by grace, does our works, aka us following the law, have anything to do with our salvation? These are some very important questions that have caused great divide amongst Christian communities. So in this video, we're going to get to the bottom of this, answer every single one of those questions, and hopefully by the end, you'll know exactly what Jesus meant when he said he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. To help guide us on this journey, we will be listening to David Wilbur, Dr. Frank Turek, R.L. Solberg, and Pastor Doug Batchelor. Let's start out with the perspective that Christians no longer need to keep the law. To help us understand this concept, here is Dr. Frank Turek.
So how did they move away from something that has not been abolished?
Well, first of all, what it means is that Jesus fulfilled the law by obeying it perfectly, and therefore, when we trust in him, we're not only forgiven, we're given the righteousness he has already accomplished by fulfilling the law perfectly. So Jesus obeyed all the Old Testament commandments. We couldn't. He did. So he has fulfilled the law. But if you read the book of Hebrews talks about the fact in Hebrews 8 that the old covenant is obsolete. The old covenant is everything written from Exodus 20 to the end of Deuteronomy. All that law, including the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were just for Israel. However, 9 of the 10 were repeated in the New and are also binding on Christians. But the old covenant, the covenant that God had with Israel, is obsolete. There's a new covenant. And that new covenant has been fulfilled by Jesus. And we do good works not out of some sort of obligation to put ourselves right with God. We do good works out of gratitude and love for what he did for us. So the old covenant didn't, I think, understand that completely. The new covenant, Jesus has come and he saves us. He fulfills the law and we trust in him.
So for my clarity, for example, when Christ would perform a miracle and he'd say, sin no more, was the law not the sin he is saying to do no more? Because I guess the way I'm thinking of it is, just because I don't murder doesn't mean that like everybody else in here can go and murder because I fulfilled that law. So that's why I'm kind of just confused.
Well, the law applies to all of us. The moral law still applies, but we're not relying on the law for salvation. That's what Paul talks about in Galatians 3, or Galatians, the book of Galatians, maybe chapter 3 or 4. He says, you can't rely on the law as if it's going to save you. Mm-hmm. The law is your schoolmaster which brings you to Christ. In other words, the law is like a mirror. You can look in the mirror and see your face is dirty, but the mirror can't wash your face for you. Or the law is like a ruler. It can show you that maybe you cut the board short in your workshop, but it can't lengthen the board for you. So the law is an indicator that we can't live up to God's standards. And so he then comes and he lives up to those standards for us and takes our punishment upon himself. And so by trusting in him, then we are not held responsible in the afterlife for that kind of punishment. We might get punishment now for disobeying the law, but we're not going to get punishment from the government authorities, but we're not going to get punishment from God because he's already punished Jesus.
She brought up a great point to Dr. Frank Turek. Jesus says, go and sin no more. Well, what is sin? Sin is the transgression of the law. If there's no law, then how do you know you're sinning? So while we are saved by grace, it does seem like our works, as they are related to the law, are still important to Jesus. However, according to what Dr. Frank Turek said, it seems like they don't matter at all. Before we continue with the video, I just want to say we have YouTube memberships on the channel. If you like what we're doing here and you want to support, please consider joining. It would mean the world to me. I wouldn't be able to do this without all of you. So thank you for your support. Thank you for watching. Now, let's get back to the video. Let's continue to dive into this perspective, but focus on what Jesus meant when he said he came to fulfill the law. To help us understand this clearer, here is R.L. Solberg.
In Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Here Jesus clearly says that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets. So in what sense do you suppose he was talking about abolishing and fulfilling? Now, I know that might seem like a silly question to ask because the statement makes complete sense at face value. Why would we think that he meant abolish and fulfill in some certain sense? And yet, like so many of Yeshua's other teachings, there's more to this statement than a surface level interpretation can explain. This verse doesn't exist on an island. And to really get what Jesus is teaching here, we need to view this statement in light of the rest of what Jesus taught and all that Jesus did and what the New Testament as a whole teaches us about him. Now, there are a number of examples in Scripture that I could point to, but let's just talk about one, and that's this. The New Testament teaches that it was Jesus who brought the Torah commands for sin sacrifices to an end. Hebrews chapter 10 explicitly teaches this. It says that Jesus appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself, and that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all, and that Yeshua offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, and that by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified, and therefore there is no longer any offering for sin. Wow, that's a pretty unequivocal teaching. Because of the sacrifice of Jesus, the Mosaic commands given in Leviticus 16 requiring blood sacrifices for sin no longer apply. So in a very real sense, Jesus abolished the Torah's sin sacrifices. And that introduces some tension for us, right? We have a statement from Jesus in Matthew 5 that, if we take it completely literally, contradicts what the book of Hebrews teaches about the Torah's sin sacrifice commands. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law. And he adds in verse 18 that not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And yet, we find in the book of Hebrews that Jesus changed much more than an iota of the law. He completely put to rest the Torah's Yom Kippur commands requiring blood sacrifices for sin. They're done. So how can we resolve this tension? Well, one option, and it's pretty drastic, would be to reject the book of Hebrews, right? We could just rip it out of the New Testament. But of course, when we start picking and choosing which parts of Scripture should stay and which parts should go, we've headed off the deep end into heresy, and it's not the Bible we believe, but ourselves. So another option for resolving this tension would be to look at this passage in Matthew 5, and just like in Matthew 10, where we need to ask, well, in what sense did Jesus not come to bring peace? We could ask here in Matthew 5, in what sense did Jesus not come to abolish the law? So the word Matthew uses in this passage that's translated into English as abolish is the Greek word katalisai, and it means to throw down, to demolish, or destroy. And Jesus said he didn't come to do that, but rather to fulfill the law and the prophets. So I think a more scripturally sound way to interpret Yeshua's words here in Matthew 5 is that he did not come to destroy the law, but to bring it to its intended completion by fulfilling it. So, did Jesus abolish or destroy the law? No. But has it come to an end? Yes. Follow me on this. Romans 10:4 says that Jesus is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And the phrase, the end of the law, could mean a couple things. The Greek word in play here, which is often translated into English as end, is the word telos, which can simply mean end, but it can also refer to the aim or the goal or the purpose of something, which is why the CJB translates this phrase as, for the goal, the telos, at which the Torah aims is the Messiah. And the NIV says, Christ is the culmination, the telos of the law. The NIRV says Christ has fulfilled everything the law was meant to do. And what was the aim or the goal of the law of Moses? Well, Galatians 3 verses 24 and 25 say that the purpose of the law was to serve as a tutor or a guardian to guide God's people until Christ arrived. Verse 24, so then, the law was our guardian until Christ came. Pretty plain, right? In order that we might be justified by faith in Jesus. But now that faith in Jesus has come, we are no longer under a guardian. We're no longer under the law. In other words, there are two ways that the law of Moses could come to an end. One is by destroying and tearing it down. The other is by fulfilling it. And Jesus said that he came not to do the former, but to do the latter. Warren Wiersbe uses the great example of an acorn to show that there's more than one way for something to end. An acorn can be smashed with a hammer, or it can be planted in the ground and allowed to grow into an oak tree. In either case, the acorn comes to an end. It no longer exists. In the case of the hammer, it's destroyed, or we might say abolished. But in the case of planting the acorn in the ground, it comes to an end by fulfilling its intended purpose, its goal, its telos. So we can think of the Mosaic covenant as the acorn, and Jesus and his new covenant as the oak tree. And the acorn and the oak tree it becomes couldn't coexist even if they wanted to, right? The new and the old are incompatible. You can't live by the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus at the same time. The law of Moses commanded blood sacrifices for sin. The gospel says there are no more offerings for sin. They can't both be true at the same time. So in Matthew 5:17, Jesus is saying that he didn't come to smash the law of Moses with a hammer. He came to grow it into the oak tree it was always intended to become.
That acorn analogy was brilliant, but our next speaker has a different interpretation. In fact, he calls out R.L. Solberg directly. To hear his interpretation, here is David Wilbur.
Matthew 5:17-20 is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Following the Beatitudes at the start of his sermon, Jesus calls upon his followers to live as salt and light and to exhibit good works so that the world will give glory to the Father. The rest of the sermon elaborates on the nature of those good works, starting with Jesus' foundational statement about the law in Matthew 5:17-20. This passage offers crucial insight into Jesus' perspective on the law and serves as his thesis statement regarding how his followers should relate to the law. Jesus begins his statement on the law by commanding his listeners to think correctly about his mission. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or prophets. Here, Jesus prohibits his listeners from even thinking that he came to abolish the law or prophets, which implies that some of his listeners thought that he did come to abolish them. This command against incorrect thinking is perhaps intended to address the Pharisees who repeatedly accused Jesus and his disciples of disregarding the law. Jesus' statement in Matthew 5:17 directly refutes such accusations. As Noel Rabanowitz explains, Jesus' prohibition against thinking that he came to abolish the law is intended to confront, quote, the charge that he has abandoned the Torah of Moses, and reassure his listeners that he, quote, was not guilty of antinomianism. Thus, believing that Jesus came to abolish the law violates Jesus' command in Matthew 5:17. His listeners are not even to think that he came to do that. What did Jesus mean by the law and prophets? Well, this phrase refers to the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament. However, within the didactic context of Jesus' sermon, the terms law and prophets also have a legal connotation. When Jesus says that he did not come to abolish the law, he isn't talking about abolishing the law's existence. He is talking about abolishing the law's legal authority. That is, Jesus did not come to abolish the authority of the law or the prophets. But what exactly did Jesus mean when he said that he did not come to abolish? Well, to abolish something means to cause it to be no longer in force. So to abolish the law and prophets means to do away with, annul, or repeal them. In other words, Jesus forbids his listeners from thinking that he came to nullify or repeal God's commandments found in the law and prophets. Several first-century Jewish texts give us additional insight into what it means to abolish the law. Like Matthew 5:17-20, these Jewish texts employ the term kataluo, translated abolish in Matthew 5:17, as well as the related term luo, translated relaxes or breaks in Matthew 5:19, in reference to the law. For instance, 4 Maccabees 17:9 characterizes Antiochus as, quote, the tyrant who wished to abolish the way of life of the Hebrews. Moreover, in 4 Maccabees 5, there is an account of Antiochus attempting to compel the priest Eleazar to eat pork. Eleazar refuses, insisting that eating prohibited meats, quote, is an abolishment of the ancestral law. Josephus similarly writes that Antiochus, quote, put pressure upon the Jews to abolish their ancestral customs, leaving their infants uncircumcised and sacrificing swine upon the altar. These examples from Jewish literature show that to abolish the law means to deny the law's authority. Those who abolish the law disregard the law's commandments and encourage others to disregard them as well. Matthew 5:19 confirms this meaning. Therefore, whoever relaxes, luo, one of the least of these commandments, and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. In sum, Jesus commands his listeners not to think that he came to invalidate the commandments in the law and prophets. He reassures them that, unlike Antiochus, this was not his purpose. Believing that Jesus came to nullify the commandments of the Torah breaks Jesus' commandment in Matthew 5:17 against thinking that he came to abolish the law. Instead of disregarding or nullifying the law and prophets, Jesus said he came to fulfill them. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. What does it mean to fulfill the law and prophets? Well, depending upon the context, the verb to fulfill, plerao, can mean to carry out, to show forth true meaning, or to complete. So, which of these definitions best fits the context? Did Jesus come to carry out the law and prophets, to show the true meaning of the law and prophets, or to complete the law and prophets? In this context, the statement that Jesus came to fulfill the law and prophets is situated between the exhortations to perform good works and to do and teach the commandments. Moreover, the overall focus of Matthew 5-7 is, quote, on the teaching of Jesus and is intended to be didactic in function. It would seem then that the sense of fully doing or revealing true meaning fits this context better than the idea of completing. Consequently, in Matthew 5:17, fulfilling the law and prophets should be understood as fully doing and teaching them, corresponding again to Matthew 5:19, whoever does them and teaches them. Indeed, just as relaxes in verse 19 parallels abolish in verse 17, does and teaches in verse 19 parallels fulfill in verse 17. In other words, Jesus fulfills the law and prophets by teaching and demonstrating the proper way to observe them as God intended. Stephen Stiles puts it well, quote, plerao carries the idea of fulfilling or doing a requirement or religious obligation to its fullest. In the case of Matthew 5:17, it has to do with being completely obedient to the Torah and teaching it properly. However, some interpreters disagree with this understanding of to fulfill and argue that, in Matthew 5:17, the verb instead carries the meaning of bring to completion. According to this interpretation, Jesus came to fulfill the law and prophets by satisfying their prophetic predictions. Proponents of this understanding include R.L. Solberg and Andy Stanley. But did Jesus really make the law of Moses obsolete by fulfilling it? Even if we grant the assumption that to fulfill the law and prophets in Matthew 5:17 means to fulfill the prophetic symbols and predictions found in the law and prophets, there are several problems with the idea that this would somehow result in the law coming to an end. The biggest problem with this idea is that it sounds exactly like what Jesus said he did not come to do. There is no difference between abolishing something and making it obsolete. The result is the same, and since Jesus contrasts fulfill with abolish, these words cannot mean the same thing. Additionally, if we apply this logic consistently, we could reasonably conclude that many other practices that most Christians believe we should observe have become obsolete. For instance, Jesus' death and resurrection fulfilled the symbolism of baptism, but nobody believes that baptism is now obsolete and that we shouldn't baptize new believers. During the Last Supper, Jesus said that the bread and wine pointed toward his work of redemption. Jesus then fulfilled what they pointed toward, but nobody concludes from this that Christians shouldn't partake in the bread and wine. Hence, why should we think that Jesus fulfilling the law and prophets through his work on the cross renders them irrelevant for Christian practice? The immediate context further complicates this interpretation. Jesus continues his statement on the law and prophets by announcing that nothing will pass from the law until heaven and earth pass away, and warns against disregarding the commandments of the law. It makes little sense to insist upon keeping the Torah and warn about the consequences of breaking the Torah if the Torah itself is about to become irrelevant. In contrast to teachers like R.L. Solberg, Andy Stanley, Matthew Vines, and others, it is best to understand the statement, "I came to fulfill the law and prophets," as "I came to bring out the full meaning of the law and prophets." Jesus fulfills the law and prophets by teaching and demonstrating how to obey them properly. Not only does this meaning of fulfill fit the context much better than the idea of fulfilling prophecy, but it also provides an actual contrast with the word abolish. It seems strange for Jesus to contrast the notion of nullifying the Torah's commandments with the idea of fulfilling prophecy, but it makes perfect sense for Jesus to contrast the notion of nullifying the Torah's commandments with the idea of affirming them.
David makes a solid point. Fulfilling the law to completion kind of does give you the same net result as abolishing the law. So now my question is, what else does the Bible have to say about us Christians keeping God's law? Do Christians still need to keep the Ten Commandments? And how does that relate to our salvation, if at all? To help us dive deeper into those questions, here is Pastor Doug Batchelor.
Some say the Ten Commandments are not binding for New Testament Christians. What does Jesus say about this? Matthew 19, verse 17, he said, "If you will enter into life, keep the commandments." Well, obviously, for a starting point, he would be talking about the Ten Commandments. You can read in John 14, verse 15, Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Now, a lot of pastors say today, we don't have to keep the Ten Commandments anymore because Jesus fulfilled the law. Well, what does fulfill mean? When Christ came to John the Baptist to be baptized, John said to Jesus, "No, you need to baptize me because you're the Messiah." And Jesus said, "No, John, allow it to be this way now, for thus it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness." So when Jesus said fulfill all righteousness, does that mean do away with all righteousness? Some people read that verse, "Think not that I've come to destroy the law." They change it where Jesus says, "Think not that I've come to destroy the law. I've actually come to do away with it." That wouldn't make any sense. He obviously wants us to keep the Ten Commandments. How is it possible to keep the commandments? Now, sin is the transgression of the law. I don't know about you, but I am tempted every day. Am I alone? Every day I have opportunities to do the wrong thing. And every day I have opportunities to follow Jesus and make the right decision. Is it possible for us to do what God asks us to do? Romans 8, verse 3, God, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, which walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. It is possible. Philippians 1, verse 6, he that has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. You know, a few years ago, matter of fact, John Lomacane was with me. We were doing a debate, friendly debate on television with John and I, two other ministers. And the subject of the debate was the law of God. And the ministers were saying that the Ten Commandments was part of the Old Covenant, and nobody can really keep the law, and God didn't expect us to. And so I asked, can the devil tempt us to sin? They said, well, of course. And I said, so you believe the devil has the power to get us to sin, but you don't believe that God has the power to keep us from sin. So in effect, you're saying your devil's more powerful than your God. Isn't that what that would, I mean, that's where that goes. How much can I do through Christ? Without him, how much can we do? Nothing. Through Christ, all things are possible. What is the Old Covenant, and why did it fail? All right, first let's look and find out what that was. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, and you'll find the Old Covenant mentioned there. He declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even, how many? 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tables of stone. And so it tells us that the Old Covenant was the 10 commandments written on these 2 tables of stone, written by the finger of God. Now, right after the Lord made the covenant with the people, you know what a covenant is, and it's an agreement. God spoke the 10 commandments there in Exodus 20. Moses later brings down the written copy. But while he's up on the hill getting the 10 commandments, what do the children of Israel do? And so the Bible says in Hebrews 8, verse 8, for finding fault with them. Now, was the fault of the Old Covenant with the covenant and the law, or was it with the people who made a promise? See, the New Covenant is based on better promises. The Old Covenant was based on the promise of the people. All the Lord has said, we will do it. The New Covenant is based on the promise of the Lord. It says in Hebrews 8, verse 10, for this is the covenant that I will make with them, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write them in their hearts. And so God says he's going to put the law where? In the heart. He says, I'm going to write a different law in their heart. It's not a different law. Same law, different place. Same law, not their promises, his promise. Who spoke the first law? God did. Was the problem with the law or with the people? Does God ever command anybody to do something without giving them the power to do what he's asked them to do? Inherent in every command of God is built the power to perform what he's asking. That is a simple, if God says, I want you to walk across that ocean there, don't argue. You'll either walk on water like Peter, or he'll part the ocean. I mean, when God asks you to do something, you do it. And that's called obedience. And we're living in an age where even in some churches, they're acting like obedience is legalism. Obedience is not legalism. The devil is trying to intimidate Christians. As soon as you talk about the law, you know what you get called? A dirty word among Christians? Legalist. Pharisee. And so what happened is people in the church have been so intimidated by those terms, the pendulum has swung to the other side, and now everybody's so afraid to be accused of being a Pharisee or a legalist, nobody talks about the law. Jesus did. Doesn't living under grace by faith make keeping God's law non-essential? Romans 6:15, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? What does he say? God forbid. And again in Romans 3, verse 31, do we then make void the law through faith? Again, he uses that phrase, God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. Paul says in Romans chapter 2:13, it's not the hearers of the law that will be just before God, but the doers of the law will be justified. That's what Paul said. Are people saved by keeping the law? You remember my illustration? Is anyone saved by keeping the law? No. Ephesians 2, verse 8 and 9, it says very clearly, for by grace are we saved through faith, not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. We're not saved by our obedience, but if we love the Lord, we'll want to obey him. You know, if you go to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association website, he answers questions there. I just copied this off the website because Dr. Graham still has this right. Question, does God expect us to keep the 10 Commandments? Answer, the 10 Commandments are just as valid today as when God gave them to Moses over 3,000 years ago. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law. And he's got a number of other statements like that. There's not a lot of preachers that are still saying that. They're all saying, we're not under the law. And that is a really strange thing because it makes it sound like sin is being endorsed. Are there some Old Testament laws no longer binding upon New Testament Christians? Yes. And it tells you which ones they are. You can read in Ephesians 2:15, having abolished the law of commandments contained in ordinances. And it explains what these things are. This is talking about your yearly Sabbaths, meat offerings, drink offerings. It's talking about things like the Passover ceremony, circumcision. These are all ceremonial laws. The Ten Commandments are of an eternal nature. Now, don't forget this. 10 Commandments, written by God's finger. Ceremonial law, written by Moses. 10 Commandments, spoken by God's voice. Ceremonial law, spoken by Moses, or the voice of other judges. They are two completely distinct or separate laws. And so the laws that were nailed to the cross were the ceremonial laws, not the 10 Commandments.
So, according to Pastor Doug Batchelor, the law is still very much important. Our actions, even though we are saved by grace, are still very much important. Speaking of that, if you want to learn more about salvation by faith versus by works, I'll leave a video up here and down in the description where we dive into that topic specifically. But for now, let me know your thoughts about what we just talked about. Do you think Christians still need to abide by the Old Testament law? Let me know all of your thoughts down below in the comment section, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.